Hello, and welcome back to Weird on the Rocks. This is a podcast that explores the weird, unusual, strange, and unexplained, all while getting our drink on. I'm your host, Katie. First off, I want to apologize for my voice this week. It's even raspier and deeper than normal. I have really bad allergies and asthma, and I swear I don't have the coronavirus, but my voice has just been gone and it's raspy. I have no other symptoms. I don't have a cold. It's just that great time of year. So I apologize if it's a little rough today. Bear with me. But in today's episode, I'm not going to be talking about anything supernatural or spooky, but something that, in my opinion, is actually more scary, and that is doctors who kill their patients. This topic really sparked my interest after I listened to the podcast Dr. Death, which covered the story of one of the doctors I will be talking about today. Since I listened to that podcast, I've listened to a few more about other medical professionals doing unethical and illegal things, such as inseminating women with their own sperm instead of donor sperm. And it's really opened my eyes to how easy it really is for doctors to do these scary things to unknowing patients. We trust them literally with our lives, and we expect them to have our best interest in mind. So hearing about stories like the ones I'm going to share today is actually extremely terrifying. Our chances of getting killed by a serial killer or getting abducted by aliens, something like that, it's basically zero. But we all see doctors on a regular basis, and we rely on their expertise in many areas of life. If you would like to find the show, I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Weird on the Rocks Podcast, Twitter at Weird_Rocks, and the website weirdontheRocks.weebly.com. Please rate and review the show on iTunes and subscribe wherever you're listening now so you always get the newest episode right when it comes out. Before we get into the good stuff, I want to share this week's beverage of choice. So right now we are in the midst of the coronavirus panic. Things are getting a little crazy out there. People are grabbing all the toilet paper, and I definitely want to keep myself safe and healthy. So I decided to make a classic screwdriver. It's probably a good idea to get in some vitamin C right now. So what better way to do it than with some vodka? All right, well, let's get into it. Cheers, and let's get weird. Harold Frederick Shipman, or Fred as he liked to be called, was born January 14th, 1946 in Nottingham, England. He was the second of three children born to working-class parents Harold Frederick Shipman and Vera Britton. His mother, Vera, was described as a very domineering woman who was extremely hard on Fred, but the two of them had a close relationship. Fred did not have many friends growing up and was a very isolated child. As a teenager, he excelled at rugby and long-distance running and was vice president of the athletics club at his high school. When he was 16 years old, his mother Vera was diagnosed with lung cancer. Towards the end of her battle with cancer, his mother Vera had doctors coming to their home to administer morphine to her for pain management. Harold witnessed his mother, who was in agonizing pain, able to relax a bit after the morphine was given to her. Sadly, she died in 1963 when Fred was only 17, and he was very devastated by her death. His mother's passing and observing the doctors that came into their home made Fred want to go into the medical field. After failing his entrance exams the first time, he passed the second time and was accepted into Leeds University Medical School at the age of 19. That same year, he met Primrose Oxtoby, and they began dating. She soon became pregnant, and they married quickly when Fred was 19 and Primrose was only 17. The couple would go on to have 4 children together. In 1970, at the age of 24, Fred graduated from Leeds Medical School and began working as a family practitioner at Pontefract General Infirmary in Yorkshire. By 1974, he was a father of two and began working at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden as a general practitioner. The following year, Fred was caught forging prescriptions for the painkiller methadone, which he was using for himself. He was fired, fined, and forced to briefly attend a drug rehabilitation program. 2 years later, in 1977, he began working as a general practitioner at the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, a small town near Manchester. He worked there for 16 years and was known as a hardworking doctor who was trusted by his patients, but could tend to be quite arrogant and difficult to work with at times. In 1993, after establishing loyal patients and becoming a trusted doctor in the small community of Hyde, he opened his own practice. In 1998, 5 years into running his own practice, a colleague of Fred's named Linda Reynolds began to have some concerns about Fred's practice, mainly that the death rates of his patients seemed to be extremely high. This realization was due to the fact that Fred had an alarmingly high amount of death certificates for elderly women that he often needed Linda to sign off on. She also noticed that many of his patients died in similar positions and situations, often in a chair or recliner and fully dressed. She expressed concerns to the coroner of the South Manchester District, John Poehler, who confronted Fred about these concerns. Fred assured him that there was nothing to be concerned about and that many elderly women reclined in chairs for comfort purposes. Unsatisfied with this answer, the local police were contacted. They conducted a brief investigation but found no evidence of foul play. The police also did not conduct a criminal record check on Fred, so they were not aware of his history of abusing prescription drugs on the job. The investigation concluded, and Fred continued to work in Hyde as a general practitioner. Less than a year after the investigation, Kathleen Grundy, an 80-year-old widow, was found dead in her home. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was told by Fred that she died from natural causes and an autopsy was not required. Her daughter held a small funeral and Kathleen was buried. However, Angela soon began to question her mother's death and believed that something wasn't quite right. Her mother was extremely active and healthy and had no pre-existing medical conditions. She also was extremely wealthy. Angela was a lawyer and began going through her mother's financial records and found that she had a second will that Angela didn't know about. And this second will left her large estate to Dr. Fred Shipman. Angela immediately realized that this second will was a forgery, and she contacted the police and told them that Dr. Shipman had murdered her mother. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed, and a post-mortem exam revealed that she had died from a lethal injection of morphine, which took place within 3 hours of her death, the time frame in which Dr. Shipman was in her home. Police immediately raided Fred's home and found medical records, a large amount of women's jewelry, and a typewriter which he had used to write the forged will. The police became even more concerned when they remembered that Dr. Shipman had been investigated less than a year earlier and were scared that this was not the only woman that Fred had killed. Authorities contacted the families of other patients who had died under Dr. Shipman's care and found that he urged families to cremate their loved ones, making evidence of foul play impossible. However, some of the families decided to bury their loved ones instead, and most agreed for their bodies to be exhumed. 15 of his patients, all elderly women, were found to have died from lethal injections of morphine. Dr. Fred Shipman's trial began on October 5th, 1999, where he was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 case of forgery. The defense claimed that Dr. Shipman had acted out of compassion for his patients who were in pain and wanted to die. The prosecution, on the other hand, claimed that none of his patients were suffering from terminal illnesses or ever expressed to their family members that they wanted to die. Witnesses included the government pathologist who explained to the jury in detail how Dr. Shipman killed his patients and what the post-mortem examinations had shown. A fingerprint analyst explained that Kathleen Grundy's fingerprints were not found on the will, meaning that she had never physically touched it. And a computer analyst stated that Fred Shipman altered his computer records to show that his patients had medical conditions that they didn't have, and that these changes were done within a few hours of their lethal morphine doses. Another chilling detail was also revealed during the trial. In a few situations, there were other family members present in the home when the patients died. Dr. Shipman called them into the room where he was treating their loved one and explained that they had died, and then quickly called emergency services to try to revive them. However, phone records showed that Dr. Shipman never actually made these calls to emergency services and was only pretending to make the family members believe he was trying to help. Fred Shipman's history of abusing prescription drugs was also presented to the jury, and it was discovered that for years he had been falsely prescribing pain medication to patients who didn't need them, as well as visiting the homes of recently deceased patients to collect their leftover medications for disposal, when he was actually keeping them for himself. During the trial, Fred Shipman appeared arrogant and changed his story several times when asked questions that he couldn't answer. Although the defense ended with explaining to the jury that no one had actually ever seen Dr. Shipman administer lethal doses of morphine to his patients, they still found him guilty on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was given 15 life sentences as well as a 4-year sentence for the forgery and was sent to Durham Prison. After his sentencing, a clinical audit was conducted on Dr. Shipman that compared his medical records with those of other practitioners in the area. This audit found that the rates of death among his elderly patients was significantly higher than other doctors in the area, and the time of their deaths often occurred at the same time of day. The audit concluded that Dr. Shipman likely killed way more than 15 patients and put the estimate at 236 patients over a 24-year period. Soon after, an inquiry commission chaired by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith examined records from 500 patients who died under Shipman's care and concluded that he killed at least 218 people. This 2,000-page document stated that Fred Shipman was, quote, addicted to killing, end quote. The scale of his killings could possibly make Fred Shipman the world's most prolific serial killer, as no other individual has committed as many confirmed murders. On January 13, 2004, Fred Shipman was found dead in his prison cell, having used bed sheets to create a noose and hang himself. Christopher Dunch was born in Montana in 1971 and grew up with his 3 siblings in Memphis, Tennessee. His father was a physical therapist and missionary, and his mother was a stay-at-home mom. He played high school football and had hopes of going on to play in college. As a teen, he was described by friends as being extremely driven and competitive. He wanted to be the best at everything and was constantly challenging his friends, whether it be who could lift the most weight or chug a beer the fastest. After high school, he tried out for numerous football teams and was eventually accepted by the Colorado State Rams as a linebacker, being the only player who was a walk-on and wasn't recruited. Although he wasn't a naturally gifted football player, what he lacked in skill, he made up for in determination. His favorite movie was Rocky, and he wanted to be just like Rocky Balboa, who worked his way to success. However, during practice, he had trouble grasping the drills and often had to get extra help from his teammates and coaches. He would ask to run the same drills over and over after the others had already mastered them, but he continued to struggle. His teammate and friend, Chris Dozier, said that he expected Chris Dunch to eventually give up and realize he wasn't meant to play football, but he wouldn't admit defeat. One day, the two were on the phone, and Dozier said something to Dunch about him being a bad wrestler. 20 minutes later, Dunch showed up at Dozier's doorstep and challenged him to a wrestling match in the front yard. Dozier said he beat him easily, and Dunch asked for a rematch. He beat him again, so Dunch left. 15 minutes later, he returned again and said he went and thought about it and wanted one more rematch, and Dozier beat him again. Eventually, Christopher Dunch decided to return to Tennessee and enrolled at the University of Memphis, where he set his sights on becoming a neurosurgeon. He received his undergraduate degree, then went on to get his MD and PhD from the University of Tennessee Health Center, and also completed a spine fellowship program. Dunch then entered his residency program, which would take him 5 years to complete. In 2006, Dunch began to conduct research on stem cells and discovered a way to produce stem cells from invertebrate discs in cultures outside the body. Creating cells from a culture would eliminate the need for human extraction. Dunch received a patent for this technology and, along with several other scientists and doctors, created the company Dysgenics. During this time, those close to him began to notice very concerning behavior. He would often pull all-nighters before going to work. He drank vodka and orange juice in the mornings before he went to work and liked to partake in recreational drugs such as LSD and cocaine. A friend of Dunch named Megan Kane later said, quote, "I thought it was pretty amazing that he was even able to go to work the next day. Like, he wasn't scared. He didn't not want to. He wasn't paranoid. After you've spent a night using cocaine, most people become paranoid and want to stay in the house. They don't want to go participate in any extraneous activities, and he was totally fine going to work." End quote. During his 4th year of his residency, he was suspected of being under the influence of cocaine and was sent to an impaired physicians program, completed it, then returned to his residency to finish out his last year. While the average surgeon performs 1,000 surgeries before ending their residency program, somehow Christopher Dunch performed less than 100. By 2011, Dunch had been fired from Dysgenics, the company that he helped create, due to his inappropriate behavior. He was hired by the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute in North Dallas. He was given glowing reviews by all of his supervisors. Their reference letters described him as a brilliant and talented surgeon and that they would be lucky to have him on their staff. There was not a single mention of his drug use or the fact that he had performed less than 100 procedures. Around this time, Dunch learned that his girlfriend, Wendy Young, was pregnant, and she moved to Texas with him. His friend, Jerry Summers, also moved to Texas with him to help him out, and soon Dunch hired him to help him full-time. This included balancing his checkbook for him, managing his calendar, and taking the multiple cars Dunch wrecked to the body shop. After beginning his work at the Spine Institute, he also received surgical privileges at Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano, Texas. Friend Bailey Cooper, who partied with Dunch a lot, said that he was extremely forgetful and disorganized and constantly losing things, such as his keys and wallet, and that their friend group often joked about how once he was a surgeon, they would never let him operate on them. Once he was granted privilege to operate at the Baylor Regional Medical Center, he immediately began performing surgery on patients. One of the first was Lee Passmore. Passmore had extreme back pain and had become hooked on opiates. He wanted to have surgery to alleviate the chronic pain and to help him get off of his pain meds. After doing some research, he decided that Dr. Dunch was the right surgeon to perform his operation. For this surgery, Dr. Mark Hoyle assisted Dr. Dunch. Hoyle had heard rumors about Christopher Dunch, but had never worked with him. He said that while scrubbing up for the procedure, Dunch was saying things about the other surgeons being incompetent, and him being the only one who was doing the job right. Hoyle said, quote, "I thought he was either really, really good or he's just really, really arrogant and thought he was good." End quote. Hoyle's job was to cut Lee Passmore open and sew him shut, while Dunch did the rest of the operation. Hoyle made an incision above the groin and moved the tissue and organs out of the way so Dunch had clear access to the spine to fix a herniated disc. But Hoyle says that almost immediately he noticed that there was way too much blood and blood in places where there shouldn't be any. But Dunch didn't seem concerned, and Hoyle said it looked like Dunch was, quote, fishing in a pond at night, saying he was working by feel, not sight, end quote. Dunch then announced that he was going to remove the ligament that separates the disc from the spinal cord, something extremely dangerous. Dr. Hoyle stood in front of Dr. Dunch and said that this was too dangerous and that even his casual attitude about it was dangerous. Dunch agreed and instead inserted a surgical cage where the disc was that would alleviate the pressure and pain that Lee Passmore was experiencing. However, Hoyle says that an x-ray showed that the cage was put in too far to the left, and when Dunch tried to reposition, he stripped a screw, so the cage had to remain in an incorrect position forever. Hoyle said that the entire surgery was extremely sloppy and immediately canceled the 2 upcoming surgeries he was supposed to assist Dunch on. Lee Passmore was left with permanent damage from this and to this day cannot feel his feet and walks with a limp. Jeffrey Chaney had back surgery done by Dunch and woke up to find that he had accidentally removed part of his spinal cord, leaving the entire right side of his body paralyzed. In 2011, 54-year-old school teacher Kelly Martin was getting Christmas ornaments down from the attic when she fell off the ladder, resulting in a herniated disc. Her husband, Don Martin, said, quote, "From the initial fall, it wasn't that super great. It was a lingering pain. It never went away. We did all kinds of treatments to help alleviate the pain, but it just remained persistent. We were planning on going on an out-of-country trip, so we thought we might as well get this fixed before we did. And she was in more pain than she let on. I could see it. I didn't want her to go through that if we could avoid it. That's when we started exploring surgery options." End quote. This is when their family doctor recommended Dr. Dunch to perform her surgery. Together, they met with Dunch, who told them it was a very simple and routine surgery that would take only about 45 minutes. Dawn said, quote, "He sounded very articulate. It sounded like he knew what he was doing. We figure it wouldn't be an issue. He said it was a minor surgery, but that she would be okay after the procedure. A very simple, common procedure. That's what we were hoping for, a quick recovery." End quote. But Don says that the surgery took much longer, and he began to feel nervous. He said, quote, "About an hour later, I'm still sitting in the waiting room and I hadn't heard from anybody. I asked one of the nurses to check and see what was going on. Then 15 to 20 minutes later, Dunch came out. He tells me the surgery went well and she's moving around, but was in obvious pain, so they gave her some medicine. She may have to go up to ICU or maybe stay overnight, but she was going to be okay. That's when I called my daughters to come to the hospital. That's when I realized this is not good." End quote. Soon after his daughters arrived, Don says that the ICU physician, the anesthesiologist, and Dunch all came into the room and told him the devastating news that his wife was dead. Don said, quote, "They told us they tried everything they could, but they couldn't save her. That's when the girls lost it. I lost it. That's when the nightmares started. We didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her. We went in there with good faith, believing in the doctors and the medical world so they could help us. Instead, they ended up turning our world upside down. It was pure misery. I was totally lost. My world just ended right then and there." End quote. Medical records showed that Kelly Martin had bled to death after Dunch sliced into one of her arteries. 63-year-old Floella Brown chose Dunch as her doctor for her disc removal and spinal fusion surgery. Records show that Dunch removed bone from a part of Brown's body that would never have to be removed and served absolutely no medical explanation. In doing this, he slit open an artery. Floella Brown made it out of surgery and seemed okay for the first day of recovery, telling her husband that her back felt better. But soon, she began acting strangely, fidgeting around and not acting like herself. Then, she had a stroke and quickly began deteriorating and was taken to the ICU. The next day, instead of tending to Floella Brown, who was fighting for her life in the ICU, Dunch went ahead with his next operation. 74-year-old Mary Eford chose Dunch as her surgeon for back surgery after doing extensive research on doctors in the area. She thought that he was a nice man and could only find positive testimonies about his work online. She felt hopeful about the surgery and looked forward to living pain-free. But when she woke up from her procedure, she was screaming. She immediately realized that she couldn't feel her legs. During the procedure, she lost a half-gallon of blood, and blood was dripping out of her body and onto the operating floor. A different doctor would later find that Dunch had put an implant that should have been on a bone directly into her tissue, that a random screw had been drilled into her spinal cavity, and that a nerve root had been damaged. The doctor said that Dunch had, quote, done virtually everything wrong, end quote. During his operation on Mary Efert, his patient from the previous day, Floella Brown, was declared brain dead and was taken off of life support. Mary Efert's botched surgery would leave her in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. In 2015, Efert said, quote, "He took away my life as it was, my freedom," end quote. In less than 24 hours, Christopher Dunch had killed one woman and permanently injured another. And yet, instead of sounding the alarm and reporting Dunch to the Texas Medical Board to stop him from operating on anyone else, Baylor revoked his surgical privileges at their hospital, but wrote him a glowing reference letter for his next job, and he was quickly hired at University General Hospital. Instead of taking a risk and reporting this dangerous doctor, they made it so that he wasn't their problem anymore, and now someone else would have to deal with him. Around this time, Dunch's good friend and personal assistant, Jerry Summers, decided that he wanted Chris to operate on him. Jerry was unaware of any of the botched surgeries that Dunch had performed, and he saw him as a talented and experienced surgeon. Dunch, who was well aware of killing Floella Brown and Kelly Martin, as well as the numerous other people he had injured, decided to go ahead with operating on his best friend. Jerry Summers had an old injury from his years of playing football, and it had been re-injured in a car accident. Medical records show that Dunch had severed a blood vessel, and to stop the bleeding, he packed Jerry's back with a substance called gel foam, and he used a lot of it, which constricted Jerry's spine. Dunch also removed too much bone, leaving Jerry's head not securely attached to his body. When Jerry woke up from the procedure, he wasn't in pain, but he could not feel his legs. Dunch told him that he had lost a lot of blood, but the paralysis was temporary and not to worry. Days went by and Jerry remained in the ICU, still paralyzed. Dunch checked in on him a few times, but remained extremely cavalier about Jerry's condition and had no answers or explanations for him. Jerry wanted to believe that his friend had done a good job and that he would be okay, but eventually he lost his temper on a nurse, yelling at her that Dunch had messed up the surgery because they had been up the whole night before, drinking and doing coke. When the administration came to talk to Jerry about this accusation, he recanted and said that it wasn't true. After a few weeks, another doctor had to give Jerry the devastating news. He was permanently paralyzed and would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Dunch never came to apologize to Jerry or to explain what had gone wrong. After his operation on his best friend, Jerry Summers, Dunch would go on to perform 29 more surgeries. Orthopedic surgeon Dr. Robert Henderson had heard the name Christopher Dunch and had heard the rumor that he had paralyzed his best friend. Dr. Henderson was asked by his hospital administration to check on the condition of a patient of Dunch's, and he said immediately, quote, "My antennas were up," end quote. Dr. Henderson had discovered, quote, "an implanted screw that was grossly malpositioned. My first thought as I discovered the gravity of the situation was that this man may not even have been trained as a physician, let alone a surgeon. He was a megalomaniac. Every patient that I interviewed told me that one of the first things Dr. Dunch would tell them when they initially met him was that he was the best surgeon in Dallas," end quote. Henderson began doing some digging on Dunch and his history, even faxing a photo of him to the University of Tennessee, making sure that he wasn't an imposter. Finally, Henderson contacted the Baylor Hospital Administration and they revoked Dunch's privileges. Dr. Randall Kirby, a fellow surgeon, also had his concerns about Dunch, and he contacted Henderson. Dr. Kirby said, quote, "He's a dangerous surgeon. I just went up the chain of command. I told them that he was bad news." End quote. But hospitals simply kept transferring Dunch around, never actually reporting him to the National Practitioner Database or the state licensing board. They were afraid that if they put their neck out and tried to stop this man, that he would sue them. It was easier for them to simply wash their hands of him and push him along to the next place. Neurosurgeons are also one of the top money-earning positions in a hospital. On average, a neurosurgeon generates more revenue for a hospital than all other specialties except an invasive cardiologist and an orthopedic surgeon. And according to physician recruitment firm Merritt Hawkins, in 2015, a single neurosurgeon could produce his or her hospital an average revenue of $2.45 million. Within a few months, Dunch had secured privileges at Legacy Surgery Center of Frisco. Dr. Kirby was working in the emergency room at Texas Health Presbyterian Dallas when a woman named Jacqueline Troy, who was having complications from a surgery, was admitted. The doctor that performed her surgery? Christopher Dunch. Her vocal cord was paralyzed, and somehow Dunch had connected her esophagus with her trachea. But this wouldn't be the only patient Dr. Kirby would have to try to fix after Dunch had injured them. A few months later, while working at University General Hospital, Dr. Kirby worked on yet another Dunch patient, a man named Jeffrey Glidewell, who had suffered from an extreme esophagus injury. And when Kirby opened him up, he found a sponge that Dunch had left in the soft tissue of his neck. Finally, in 2013, Dunch's medical license was actually suspended due to numerous doctors, administrators, colleagues, and employees making complaints. Dunch's former office administrator, whom he had a close relationship with, even called hospitals telling them not to hire him. His license was suspended on the basis of his treatment of Kelly Martin, Floella Brown, Jeffrey Glidewell, and his friend Jerry Summers, and the Texas Medical Board cited that he had violated the standard of care for at least 6 patients. The same month that his license was suspended, Dr. Kirby and Jeffrey Glidewell both wrote to prosecutors and asked that criminal charges be filed against Dunch. In his letter, Dr. Kirby said, quote, "I am beginning to think the police are the only ones intellectually and physically capable of getting to the bottom of this matter." End quote. During this time, with Dunch unable to operate anywhere, he began to unravel. He moved in with his parents and was arrested for driving under the influence. He was driving on 2 flat tires, and the officer found an empty bottle of Mike's Hard Lemonade rolling around the floor of the car and one in the middle console. A few months later, Dunch and his longtime girlfriend Wendy Young, who he had 2 children with at this point, had separated. He was arrested for jumping over Wendy's sister's fence where she was staying, and he tried to take their son, Aiden. At this time, Wendy was in the hospital giving birth to their second child, which Dunch missed. And a year later, in 2015, Dunch was arrested for stealing $887 worth of merchandise from a Walmart, including 5 pairs of sunglasses, 5 watches, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 briefcases, cologne, and a walkie-talkie. Soon after this, he filed for bankruptcy and sold the last of his Discgenics stocks for 1/10 of their value. And shortly after this, Dunch was picked up by the police while wandering around a bank and was taken to a psychiatric hospital. When they talked to his ex, Wendy Young, she said that he had broken into her apartment several times and that one time she came home to find him standing in her kitchen covered in blood. Finally, in July of 2015, the Dallas District Attorney's Office followed through with pressing criminal charges against Dr. Dunch. A grand jury indicted him on 5 counts of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury and 1 count of injury to an elderly person. Dallas defense attorney Toby Shook said, quote, I cannot recall a physician being indicted for aggravated assault for acts committed during surgery, and not just Dallas County. I don't recall hearing about it anywhere, end quote. Dunch pled not guilty and claimed that he was in the center of a hospital-ran conspiracy just to get money, and that his patients were exaggerating and that they were fine. During the trial, prosecutors placed a lot of emphasis on the count against Dunch for permanently injuring Mary Eford, an elderly woman, as this charge would give him the longest jail sentence. Many of Dunch's former patients took the stand to testify against him, the majority of them displaying physical signs of injury and pain stemming from their botched surgeries. Prosecutors also read an email that Dunch had written to his girlfriend, Wendy, that showed his egotistical delusions. This email said, quote, anyone close to me thinks that I likely am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. Because how can I do anything I want and cross every discipline boundary like it's a playground and never lose? But unfortunately, despite the fact I'm winning, it is not happening fast enough, end quote. The email also said, quote, you, my child, are the only one between me and the other side. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer, end quote. Dunch's lawyers themselves admitted that he didn't fully understand the scope of what he had done until he saw his former patients in the courtroom. He was living in denial and couldn't accept what he had done until it was right in front of him, staring him in the face. His defense focused on the argument that Dunch didn't perform these surgeries incorrectly on purpose, but that he was poorly trained, and placed blame on the various hospitals that he had studied and worked at. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours and came back with a guilty verdict for the injuries against Mary Eford. On February 20th, 2017, Christopher Dunch was sentenced to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2045 at the age of 74. Through more investigation after Dunch's sentencing, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office learned that out of 38 surgeries undertaken by Dunch in less than 2 years, 33 of them had gone wrong. Today, all of the patients who were injured by Dunch, except for Lee Passmore, have sued him and settled, and have all signed non-disclosure agreements not allowing them to discuss their cases. Lee Passmore, however, is fighting to change the Texas law that requires patients to prove that a hospital intended to harm them when it granted privileges to someone who was unsafe. After Dunch's trial, Dawn Martin, whose wife Kelly died after a surgery performed by Dunch, said, quote, I was angry. I was angry at the medical world. If this doctor had previous bad outcomes, why did he still have the ability to do surgery? It was such a cover-up. As things progressed, I got angrier and angrier with the system. But by the grace of God, other doctors started voicing their opinions about Dunch. But how was I going to survive? How am I going to live day by day now? End quote. So what was Christopher Dunch's motive behind killing and permanently injuring his patients? Dr. Kirby says, quote, I wouldn't call him a psychopath because psychopaths are usually deliberate and they're organized. Christopher Dunch was disorganized and undeliberate. I'd call him a sociopath, end quote. Many believe that Dunch's issues go back to his days of playing football and wrestling when he couldn't grasp the basic skills and couldn't admit that he wasn't good. But instead of it being an innocent game of football, he was now a surgeon, killing people and ruining their lives. Many believe that Dunch is an egomaniac, which according to dictionary.com is, quote, a person who is obsessively egotistical or self-centered, end quote, and that his ego was too big for him to even realize that he wasn't a good doctor. Many also think that he is a narcissist, which is a personality disorder defined as, quote, a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. End quote. Many also point out the fact that Dunch struggled with substance issues and used many recreational drugs, and that mixed with a mental illness is extremely dangerous. And others believe that Dunch truly meant the words he wrote to his girlfriend Wendy, and that he wanted to be a cold-blooded killer. And instead of going out and murdering random people, he became a doctor. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, this topic is scarier to me than any ghost or alien story out there. How many times have we all gone to the doctor or had surgery, trusting that our doctor knows what they're doing? I myself have had 2 surgeries, and one of them was from a doctor that I had never even met previously. I had no prior knowledge of this guy at all, and literally put my life in his hands, trusting that he was experienced and that he would have, my best interest at heart. It's terrifying to know that there are people out there like Harold Shipman and Christopher Dunch who lack empathy for others when they are working in possibly the most empathetic career field possible. I also put a lot of blame on the hospitals that allowed these doctors to continue to work. With Dr. Shipman, there was no governing agency that looked at his pattern and realized that his patients were dying at alarmingly high rates and all in similar situations. And with Dr. Dunch, there were no hospitals that wanted to admit that he was incompetent because he brought them in a lot of money and they didn't want to put the time and effort into investigating him. In my mind, I would much rather have a lawsuit from a doctor than multiple ones from people who had been injured or killed. These hospitals also now have a reputation for allowing an obviously dangerous surgeon to continue to work for them. I know that if I lived in Texas, I would be extremely apprehensive to have a surgery performed at any of these hospitals that he worked at. Half of the hospitals in America have never reported a single doctor. And that is just terrifying to me because who knows how often something like this happens. Everyone doesn't want to deal with it, so they just move it along to the next person or the next hospital, and it just isn't right. I don't want this episode to scare anyone because doctors are an important part of our society, and I believe that probably 99% of them are well-trained and are trustworthy people. I think that what we need to do as the public is to stay well-informed and to do our research. We need to look into the people who are performing our surgeries and ask people in the community, and don't be afraid to speak up if something inappropriate happens or doesn't feel right. Just because they went to medical school and hold a prestigious job title doesn't mean that they are any better people than any of us. But as always, I want to know what you guys think. I know that a lot of true crime lovers have listened to the Dr. Death podcast. It's one of the biggest podcasts ever, I believe. But hopefully, even if you did listen to it, you still enjoyed my take on the story. And most of you probably have never heard of Dr. Shipman. I know I hadn't before I started researching this episode. So what do you guys think of these 2 doctors? What do you think about Dr. Dunch? His story really reminds me of the story of Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos, which I covered in episode 25. She displayed some of the same qualities, not being able to admit defeat or not being able to admit that she didn't know what she was doing. Like Dr. Dunch, she just kept digging herself into a deeper hole, hurting more and more people, all while acting like everything was going great. Do you guys think Dr. Dunch purposely hurt these people and got off on having power over them? Or was he just too egotistical and narcissistic to realize that he didn't know what he was doing and that he simply wasn't meant to be a surgeon? I would love to hear from you guys. And if you haven't listened to Dr. Death, please do. It's a multi-part series that really goes into depth about Dr. Dunch, and it's incredibly well done. It's one of my favorite podcasts ever. All right, well, that's going to be it for today's episode. Please find me on Facebook and Instagram at Weird on the Rocks Podcast or Twitter at Weird_Rocks and let me know your thoughts. As always, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And until next time, cheers and stay weird.
That was a Titancast episode.